Welcome to this special episode of Adoption Unfiltered, a podcast where we, like our book, illuminate the often unspoken realities of adoption from the perspective of adoptee, birth parent, and adoptive parent. I'm one of your hosts, Sarah Easterly, and I'm joined by Kelsey Vandervliet-Ranyard, a birth parent, and Lori Holden, an adoptive parent. Together, we occupy three corners of adoption, and we invite you to join us as we cover sensitive and timely issues from all three of our perspectives. What makes this episode special? Well, it's a recording of Adoption Unfiltered on the road. Coinciding with the release of the paperback version of our book, we went on a 3-city book tour, which started in Salt Lake City. We wished so many of you could have been there with us. These were just such fabulous panels, like they were for the book tours that we did for the hardcover version of the book. And so we thought finally to record our tour stops so we can bring some of the ideas and the conversations and the incredible dialogue from these tours and these amazing panels to a wider audience. Salt Lake City was the first stop on our third book tour, our 9th city overall since Adoption Unfiltered came out in hardcover. And the theme for this tour, for all three stops, was ethics in adoption. And wow, these were just incredible panelists in every city. No matter if you're an adoptee or if you love an adoptee, or if you're a birth or first parent or love a birth or first parent, and especially if you're an adoptive parent. We are certain you will find this episode and the two that follow essential to understanding today's landscape of relinquishment and adoption. We hope many adoption professionals are tuning in also, as they did for each stop of our tours in person. So let's get into it. Lori and Kelsey, welcome, of course.
Hello.
Hello.
And we're also really happy to have Ashley Mitchell here with us today. She is a birth parent. She was one of our panelists in Salt Lake City, as well as in New York and Seattle for our previous book tours. Ashley is going to help set this up, but first I'll turn it over to you, Kelsey.
I am Kelsey Vandervliet-Ranyard. I am the birth parent in Adoption Unfiltered. And we just wanted to start by talking about why we started our adoption ethics tour in Salt Lake City. Utah adoption has been quite a hot button issue, especially in the last probably year or two. And Ashley Mitchell has joined us today, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Utah. Ashley and I, fun fact, have 2 years ago almost started this project called Utah Adoption Rights. Our goal was then and is now to ensure that women who are being moved out to Utah for the purpose of adoption are safe, informed, and empowered when making that decision. We knew initially that we could not tell someone what to do, and we don't wish to. We don't wish to make decisions for other people at all. What a task that would be if we actually wanted to do something like that. But also we just wanted to make sure that these women were protected, as well as their children were protected from malintent or exploitative practices. So, Ashley, do you want to talk about doing for 2 years almost now?
Yeah, so I'm Ashley Mitchell. I am a birth mom. I placed my son almost 20 years ago, which is just crazy to me. I think this issue, I mean, it hits a little bit differently for me too, because I'm born and raised in Utah. I placed my son in Utah. And so there's a lot of personal attachment to the harm that's happening within my home state. I think it's easy to pretend that those things aren't happening and that you can't do anything. But when Kelsey and I first kind of got together, we'd been watching things play out for many years, through social media and through the news. And we just said, the stories just got so overwhelming that we just said, we can't just sit here. I live here. Like, what can we do? And we just really, I mean, bare bones, grassroots, like no funding, no plan, just how do we at least help the women understand their rights, coming to a state that they don't know, they don't live in, they um, wouldn't necessarily have the knowledge or the skill set to manage a system here. And so we just kind of started putting that out there. And one of the best ways for us to do that was to just go door to door. And so we started printing flyers with for Utah adoption rights that just were stripped down to say, these are your rights. If these things are being violated, then you can advocate for yourself, and this is how you can do that. And it has been, I mean, it's been key for us to be able to gather the kinds of information and resources that we have, but it just at the end of the day, there's so little that really we can actually do. Um, Kelsey and I aren't actually licensed or qualified to offer any legal advice or any social work or anything. And so it really was like bare minimum, at least if we know the women are in these certain apartment complexes, that they get a flyer that tells them what their rights are. And that felt like quote unquote good enough, based on our very limited ability to really help. And so my husband and kids and I, and Kelsey has been out to Utah a couple times to help, but mostly it's my husband and kids and I, and we wake up on Sunday mornings and we print flyers and we staple rubber bands to the flyers and we go door to door, and they love it's really become a whole family thing. They're married to a birth mom who's very involved in the community, and so they're kind of just, we have an open adoption, and so Derek's very relevant and important in our home, and they're just a part of it from start to finish. And so Kelsey can talk just a little bit about the impact of the flyers, but it's been a really interesting way, just a really creative and interesting way for us to be able to reach the moms and then just watch what happens from the community, people that live there that have nothing to do this, that have watched and seen some of the impact in their own neighborhoods. And so it's been really cool. So that's kind of my job with boots on the ground, is to get the flyers on the doors. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this project wouldn't be possible without you being physically located there, just
Yeah.
for how particular the scheme is.
Yeah.
And so, and then I feel so helpless sometimes in California because I'm like, I could just go do it, but I obviously can't.
Yeah.
But we knew we had knowledge, and information to be able to distribute to the women. And that's kind of where our capacity and so we were like, how can we just deliver that information
Hmm.
and also deliver it in a way where they can digest it and where it can make sense to them, because you're communicating with people that are a lot of times in crisis and they're in survival mode. And so how do you get that information to them and they can receive it? And so we are always developing new things on our website. We're overhauling the website over the holidays right now, trying to make things just more effectively communicated and easy to find and user friendly. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's where it started. I think there's a lot of stuff going on in the media right now. There's a lot of stuff going on in the government right now. The FBI issued new guidance on adoption fraud for both adoptive parents and expectant and birth parents. Um, and really helpful, actually. It's rare that I say that something that came from the government is really helpful. But it's really helpful information for people that are in the adoption process or have just completed the adoption process and are looking back on their experience, like what the heck was that? And a lot of times, recently, a lot what I'm hearing from people is like, God, that was a racket. Like whatever that was, that experience was, that was such a racket. And so, this guidance from the FBI is really helpful. The Adopt Act got introduced, a bipartisan legislation that would prohibit unlicensed intermediaries from providing adoption services and advertising those services in adoption. Um, And yeah, we've got these ongoing, coming from multiple angles. People are paying attention to this issue. And so Salt Lake felt like such a red or white hot center of this issue. And so we started in Salt Lake, for that very reason. So
We're tired, if you can't tell by the list of everything that's going on.
we're tired, but we're not at the same time, you know? So,
I think as being
uh,
a birth mom, like it's so emotional. Sometimes I look around the room, when we're sitting in hearings and stuff, and I'm like, why is it the birth moms that are here? Why are the birth moms pounding the pavement? Why, if don't we have the people that should be, fighting for us? But if it's not going to be us, then, who's it going to be? Because the professionals that put themselves in a position to not be the trusted party to fight for us. And so it's been really important as birth moms to step up and use our voice for those that can't. This story isn't about us. This isn't Kelsey's and I's personal experience. But we've talked to enough women to know that someone needs to be in the room to advocate for them because they haven't had that before.
I think we also just have a unique perspective on how the process should happen. By From me working in adoption for years, and Ashley's been providing post-placement services, so we've heard literally hundreds of stories from birth moms. We've witnessed things happen in the field. We know like the standards to which things should be up to, and so we did have like a unique perspective. And also, we haven't done this alone by any means. We have
Yeah, for sure.
so many people. We wouldn't have the documentation that we have had we not built relationships with adoptive parents, with adoptees, with other professionals in the field who are also concerned about these
Mhm.
things. We wouldn't have, and even just community members in Utah that have
Yeah.
nothing to do with adoption, healthcare providers, and people in the jails even. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just like kind of incredible to see people really care about this issue. And so sometimes it can feel very isolating, like we're the only ones doing it, but other times I think more realistically, I think we're like, oh, maybe this is just like been our job to be the connectors here and
Yeah.
help people, focus and care about this issue. And I think we've been really, um I don't know, it's been really, I hate to say it's been a blessing because it's really not my style, but honestly sometimes I do feel that way, for lack of a better phrase,
Yeah.
that's the type of support that we continue to receive. So
Hmm.
One of the reasons that we recorded this panel and that we're sharing this episode is because we do want to help spread awareness and spread the message of what's needed in Utah. So for anyone listening, what do you both recommend people do to help out? What can they do to help further this cause and this initiative in Utah at this time?
I think I think one of the most important things, and Ashley might have something different to say, but I think for me, continuing to boost this issue, it's hard on like social media, and like you have a window where things are interesting to people and then it dies down. Um, and so continuing to talk about these things, and also not just talk about them, but just ask questions. So I think people, what we are seeing right now is, we'll talk about this issue, a new media piece will come out, and then an agency comes to defend themselves and say, well, this isn't true because of this. And I'm like, that can't be the end of the conversation. We have to keep digging and keep asking questions. And we want people to be skeptical and be more cautious about, their choices that they make in the adoption process, and what narrative that they choose to believe. And I'm not at all saying that our narrative should be the only narrative that exists or the only true narrative. But I do want people to ask more questions and engage in conversation about this, because it really does matter. And these are the stories that are being written about children who grow up into be adults. And that to me, there's nothing more important than preserving the integrity that surrounds that.
Yeah, just to piggyback right off of that, really the biggest thing is, we've sat for many years with adopted parents in the aftermath of recognizing the role that they have played in some of these practices and policies and things, most of the time unknowing of the full scope of the picture. And look, it's a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask the families to really sit and go through their documents and look at their checkbooks and look at where they stepped into those spaces and trusted those people. And we've sat with countless adoptive parents just in that guilt of just trying to make sense of what did we do and how did this happen, and we thought we were doing due diligence and all of those things, and it's so much to ask of them. And again, we wouldn't be here without those that were finally willing to just kind of have their own reckoning to say, we were a part of this, we can do something, this is how this is going to play out. Because at some point those kids, like Kelsey said, are going to start to ask questions, are going to grow up and do their own research, and being able to come forward in those spaces and own, being part of the problem and part of the solution, right? These families are coming to those spaces and trying to figure that out. And we are very aware that it's asking a lot to challenge what you believe about how you grew your family. And there's a lot of grace in that. There's so much grace in that.
I think too, like for these kids, like sometimes we phrase things to get adoptive parents' attention about how this will begin to be on their radar once their child gains like the ability to ask questions. And we kind of phrase it as like, they're going to ask you questions and you got to be prepared. And I think it's more than that. I think it's more than just being prepared to have rebuttals or to have answers to questions. It's also about who this individual is as a person. And some of these stories are so honestly, like, to put it plainly, are so nasty in the way things occurred that this is not just a question that you have to answer someday. This is an occurrence of how they joined your family and how something that they could mentally and emotionally grapple with for the rest of their life, and it could really impact them. And I think that if we start to see like how this really affects the child and not necessarily what will be required of us, I think it's comprehensive in that way. It's like it's not just about answering a question when they turn 16. It's about them living with the consequences of choices that were made on their behalf.
At the event, I did read my op-ed, and my parents crossed ethical lines in very similar private adoption, and what was a gray market adoption. And yeah, it is a lot to put on me, and to try to understand their choices, and the pressures and the unfair situation that my birth mother was put in, and the ethical lines that were crossed. And so absolutely stand by that. And the posture of for adoptive parents of trying to understand and do better. And even if the past can't be changed, but to try, what can you do to help be part of the solution going forward? Okay, thank you both so much. This was a really good setup for Salt Lake City, why it mattered, and why we had our first stop of this ethics and adoption tour there. So let's go now to the recording from our event. I'd like to introduce you to Dani Zimmerman. Dani is a writer and medical researcher based in Salt Lake City, focused on centering the adoptive voice and bringing awareness to issues of identity formation, trauma, and grief across the adoption journey. Dani was transracially adopted as an infant here in Salt Lake City through a private agency that she remains in contact with. Her two younger siblings, not biologically related to her, were adopted through the same agency, also in closed adoptions, and the three of them grew up with their adoptive family in a rural, conservative, mostly white town. Dani is in the process of reunion with all the complexities, fears, and joys inherent to that journey. My first question for you, Dani, is this. When you reflect on your life as an adoptee, what has the journey been like? And what are some of the challenges you've experienced that most people wouldn't know about, especially when seeing you as a high-functioning, successful person?
What I want people most to know about is that adoption is a lifelong trauma, and adoptee is a lifelong identity. There is no area of my life that hasn't been touched by adoption. It's something that colors the way that I see the world and the way that I approach all of my identities. If you've seen the movie Inception, there's this concept in it that says that an idea is something that can become so insidious that it changes everything about you. And I think that I was born into this idea that says that I don't deserve to be here and that I don't belong in any space. And it's taking a lifetime of efforts in order to overturn that and fill it with ideas that make more sense for the journey that I'm on now. So yeah, I think to look at me and to see me in my competence and my confidence, those are very real, but what you may not see is the amount of effort that goes into maintaining these. Not only maintaining the competency itself, but maintaining the idea that you see the competency, because that's how I can make up for the idea that I shouldn't be here, that I shouldn't exist. So I think that, again, all of this is to say that there's nothing that isn't untouched by adoption when you're an adoptee. It's something that I will forever be grappling with. So I think that's what I can say to that.
Thank you for that, Dani. So private adoption continues to be a fraught issue within Utah, but you are still in close contact with your adoption agency, as I mentioned earlier, Children's Service Society of Utah. Can you speak to what has drawn you to continue that relationship?
So I do feel that I have a bit of an unusual experience with my adoption agency in that I've continued to find a lot of healing and a lot of growth through the agency that I was adopted through, that my siblings were adopted through. And I say unusual just because in being in contact and community now with as many adoptees as I've had, I've seen that there's a lot of wariness to be involved with anyone who was involved with your initial adoption. And oftentimes for good reason. There's a lot of unscrupulous practices that exist, particularly within Utah, to coerce birth mothers and to withhold information from adoptees. But when professionals are making a big effort to center the adoptee experience, which has been the case that I've had with my adult adoptee support groups, with the therapy services that I've received, what we develop is a relationship of trust. And through that trust, I think that we can finally have an experience of healing, and we can understand that the systems that exist in a lot of ways to exploit us can also be used to heal us. So yes, I would like to see more people get to have this understanding, and I really would strongly urge other professionals to learn from this example and to seek out other people within the adoption space who are making this effort to center the adoptee experience in all things.
So my last question for you is, if you could wave a magic wand when it comes to ethics and adoption, what changes would you like to see made?
Well, my goal for adoption is always been to see fewer and more thoughtful adoptions. So to that end, I would like to see a continual erosion of adoption as a private sector, as an industry. And I'd like to see the rise of social support networks that can support the individuals who may be driven to make these decisions. And again, oftentimes under duress or under coercion. So I am just continuously amazed to be in community with adoptees and our allies and advocates who are doing this work at a larger level to pass the legislation that is needed to really get at the heart of this corruption and to create a better system. For me personally, I think I will always be on the individual level. I am a storyteller, I'm a story collector. I make a great effort in my life to learn from and to communicate the stories that I hear from other adoptees, to share my own story. Because once you speak to other adoptees, once you start to learn from the space of adoptees, you understand why there's a need to have conversations like this. You understand why there may be discussions of ethics in the first place. And that is because this is not an ethical practice. So when you learn firsthand of the experiences that people have gone through, and I mean, it's not my place to speak to all of the things that I've heard other adoptees go through. But once you start to learn about the things that can result from adoption and from just the very bare bones of what that means, then you can't go back. There will never be a time when you can forget the information that you've learned from this. So it's my hope that we can have more conversations like this, that we can have more experiences, more books, absolutely more books. I'd like to see more movies too, just saying. I don't see a lot of good movies about adoption. I think people should work harder at it. But once we start to really see those experiences carried out with all the nuance and all of the thoughtfulness that's owed to adoptees, then we start to understand why it's so important to fight for all adoptees.
Thank you so much, Dani. Okay, I'll turn it over to Kelsey to introduce our next panelist.
Our next panelist is also an adoptee and also a birth parent. Jori Victory is an adult adoptee from foster care who was adopted as an infant in a closed adoption. She had an unplanned pregnancy at age 19 while in college and chose open adoption. The following year, she found and reunited with her biological family. Jori is an advocate for healthy open adoption, mental health, and post-placement care for birth mothers. She lives in Utah with her 4 children. Jori, in chapter 15, we talk about unacknowledged grief and how there are underlying dynamics for all members of the triad. As an adoptee first and then finding yourself pregnant, considering adoption, in what ways did your pregnancy trigger unacknowledged grief as an adoptee? And what feelings did this bring up for you as you walked through the adoption process?
So first and foremost, I am an adoptee, and I think Dani said it so beautifully. It shapes every part of my life. There's not a part of my life that being an adoptee doesn't touch. And when I found myself in an unplanned pregnancy and trying to decide, what to do, it broke me wide open. I didn't know that I had grief from my adoption. I had a close adoption, but I always knew I was adopted. I was very loved, grew up in a great home, great childhood, but that doesn't mean you're unscathed from the consequences of adoption. And grappling with that unplanned pregnancy and grief that I didn't know that I carried for 19 years, and it breaking me open was a lot. And I had to come to terms with a lot of my story. I chose adoption for my oldest daughter, but I also chose an open adoption because I knew that I didn't want her to grow up the same way I did, not knowing any of my family history, not knowing anything. And so that was very important to me, and I am very thankful with the family that I chose kept that open, and she just had her 17th birthday. And that we are still very much in contact, just had a visit, and but it's definitely been a journey. I've been healing and growing and stretching and unlearning and dealing with that grief on my adoptee side ever since. And then even finding my biological family, a whole nother grief cycle, right? A whole nother part of my story that I had to heal and deal with. And so those feelings, if we've seen the feelings wheel, I think I felt them all, the whole feelings wheel. During that time, I was a young 19-year-old making a grown-up decision and a very, permanent decision on a temporary situation that I was going through. And I don't think I really dealt with those feelings until after I even placed.
Our third panelist is Ashley Mitchell. Ashley Mitchell is a birth mom in an open adoption to a 19-year-old. She's the founder of Knee to Knee, an organization dedicated to in-person nationwide curriculum-based post-placement support for birth moms. She's also the co-host of the Twisted Sisterhood podcast and co-founder of Utah Adoption Rights. Ashley, in Chapter 8, I wrote about informed consent. When asked if there was anything you wish you had been told before relinquishment, you replied, "I was not told how hard open adoption would be. I was not told that my child would want and need to be a part of my life. I was never supported in how to process things as they come up in open adoption. I had to figure it out on my own." We are standing here in your home state of Utah. Knowing what you know now, what should Utah adoption professionals be doing to convey that information to moms before relinquishment?
I mean, there's other people that need to speak, so I'll try and be brief. First of all, 19 years, my son will be 20 in April. I placed here, born and raised here, placed here, have an open adoption here. His family lives here. We didn't know anything. We still don't know anything. It's a completely different concept to try and understand open adoption when you're with an adult adoptee. And no one's there with us. We're just figuring it out. We are screwing it up horribly. But we're showing up in whatever capacity we know how. And so when you unpack informed consent, I think that's the controversy, right? It's inevitable for everyone in the constellation at some point to reflect back and say, did I know? Did I know what I was getting into? Whether that's adoptive parents that pursued adoption, whether it's the adult adoptee trying to figure out and unravel decisions that were made for them, or the birth mom asking the question, was my best interest and the interest of my child considered? And I think 20 years later, that's not different. I think if you asked me if I would still make the same decision, my answer would probably be yes, because my circumstance was what it was. But also that does not mean that I do not question, unpack, relive, or get new information that reframes over and over and over for life our existence. So when you talk about informed consent and you bring it back to Utah specifically, to believe that the women that are coming here in crisis pregnancy to figure out some sort of solution to their current circumstance, that they know everything that they're signing, understanding, processing, I think is very dismissive and uneducated. I feel like it is impossible for us to understand the full picture and complexities of this decision at that time, when, especially specific to Utah, when we're brought to a place that we don't know or understand. I think to understand the legalities that you'll hear from Wes, who's an attorney, is I'm still learning, and I've been doing nothing but trying to process the legalities of this. For us to, in our most vulnerable of times, to have the expectation that we're supposed to know, understand, hear, or process anything on any level that's being shared is a complete rejection of our circumstance and where we are. And so do we have informed consent? Do we ever? But do we in that moment? No, there's no way that you can possibly bring that to the table.
Can you speak more about what is missing? How can we convey that information to moms who are going to make this decision?
I mean, for lack of a better term, to dumb down the rights of the women that we have here, I think that we expect the licensed professionals that hold the authority to be able to convey that information. And if that's not being conveyed, bringing in representation that can help explain that and advocate that for her. When she comes here and she's alone and she's dependent on the professional and they're not offering those resources to her, then we have a huge gap in power, and that becomes exploitive and that becomes problematic in that space. I think these are simple solutions to break this down to ensure that these women fully understand, at least
in this very brief touch point, because to understand the whole arc of everything that we're going to feel, I think, is impossible. But if we have a brief touch point with these women at the time of this pregnancy to the time of termination of rights, there are things that we can lay out more clearly for them that we are completely leaving out of the picture to control an outcome. And so if we can implement some of those things to ensure that these women, at least in this brief moment of time, have those representations that are there for her before that baby's brought here, then we can fix that problem.
Hi everyone, I'm Lori Holden, the adoptive parent part of the Adoption Unfiltered collaboration. And thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Ashley. Every time I hear you speak, you make me think more deeply about ethics and my role in raising the bar about them, especially pertaining to the birth mothers of the adoptees I'm raising. But what about birth fathers? Our last panelist is Wes Hutchins. Wes Hutchins is an adoptive father and Utah attorney with 30 years of experience working primarily in adoption law, domestic relations, and general litigation. He is well regarded for advocating for birth fathers' rights and has been involved in lawsuits and public discussions to address adoption law reforms in Utah. Formerly the Utah Adoption Council president, Wes made waves when he resigned in 2012 over concerns that the council was working to undermine the rights of birth fathers. Wes, would you set the stage for your appearance here on our panel?
How long do we have?
The rest of the time is yours.
No, well, that's a blessing and curse of going last, I guess. I should say, I feel very much like the thorn among all the roses up here. These are amazing, beautiful, articulate ladies, and I think we got to give them another hand. But also, I'm the thorn here because I'm the attorney. I'm the lawyer in the bunch. So please don't throw things at me. I'm trying to help here. I'm also an adoptive father. I have an adopted sister who was adopted out of Germany. I have a lot of ties to adoption in my family. And as an adoption attorney, I've done probably, last count, a little over 1,400 adoptions. Now, the bulk of those were foster parent adoptions where the children had been placed and were legally available for adoption. And that's where my 5-year-old daughter at the time was headed, was into foster care when I came to know about her circumstances, and my then wife at the time and I adopted her. But going back to your question.
Wes, ethics can be costly, but fraud costs more. You resigned as president from the Utah Adoption Council in 2012 amidst your concerns about what you called egregious cases of fraud from a few of the other members of the council. There have been a lot of conversations about the concerns of fraud in many Utah adoption tourism cases in the legislature and in the media and in other states. Can you speak more about the long-term impact of fraud and what the aftermath may look like?
Adoption fraud in Utah is a huge issue. And I know that that's a legally charged word. It's an emotionally charged word. But if you look at how Utah approaches adoption, we are like no other state. Florida probably comes close. They have a similar fraud immunity statute, but it doesn't go quite as far as Utah does. I can tell you hands down, from the near 35 years I've been practicing law now, I don't know where that came from, how I've survived this long in this industry, but I can tell you with my experience that there is no other state like Utah. Utah's become the go-to state for this reason. And I'm watching your body language right now very closely to see how you react. I call it the suspension of disbelief, because people, when I tell them this, they usually shake their head and they're like, how can that be? Utah has legalized fraud in the context of adoption. This used to be 78B-6-106. It's now been recodified as 81-13-104, if anyone wants to look it up. Come see me afterwards, I'll give you those citations again. But basically what that statute says, ladies and gentlemen, is that you can commit fraud in the adoption realm and get away with it. You can immunize an adoptive placement from being undone on the grounds of fraud, what the statute says is that you can sue for money damages, but you can never get your child back. So what they're suggesting, our legislature in its infinite wisdom, is saying dads, moms, anyone involved that's been victimized by these fraudulent practices, I think we refer to it as unscrupulous practices, and it very much does happen in Utah. Anyone that's been victimized by that, you can go out and sue for fraud damages, but again, you can never undo the adoption. And so that's something that we've seen has been used by some adoption agencies to actually coach birth mothers on how to cut fathers out of the parenting picture by saying to them things such as, after you come to Utah and place your child for adoption, just go home to your home state and tell the dad the baby died. It would be easier. I started to see this history, this fact pattern repeat itself over and over, where dads would come to me and say, I got a text from the mom and actually had a picture of the baby in a casket. She told me that the child had died. Turns out the child hadn't died, but had been brought to Utah. And let's just be honest, essentially, for all intents and purposes, the child's been trafficked to Utah to cut the dad out of the picture. Now, one thing that you didn't indicate about my qualifications, and that's okay because there's a few things about me. I've become a constitutional rights attorney in this realm of adoption, and so I am a big believer in maintaining, preserving, and advancing the Constitution, the constitutional rights of everyone touched by adoptions. That includes fathers, mothers, adoptive parents, because what we see happening over and over again is pretty much everyone that's touched by adoption can potentially become a victim of what's happening in the state of Utah. I don't want to be mischaracterized as someone who is anti-adoption. I'm not. I'm very much in favor of adoption, as I indicated before. I have lots of family ties to adoption. I just happen to believe that they should be done morally, ethically, and constitutionally. Let's just, for just 1 minute, let me tell you what that means constitutionally. In our country, we have, each and every one of us, the right to what's called due process. Due process basically means that we receive notice of any effort to take away our rights, and we have an opportunity to be heard in court about what those rights mean and how they're implemented and applied in our lives. So it's notice and an opportunity to be heard. When you see individuals and professionals taking advantage of these difficult circumstances that so many are in these unplanned pregnancies and bringing mothers from out of state, you start to see this cutting of corners, the non-conveyance of notice to fathers and others, because they don't want them to come to court. They don't want them to assert their rights, and so they invoke the fraud immunity statute in Utah as a way to get around those rights. And that is at the very core of what we can label clearly as unconstitutional. If you go back to even the passage of the fraud immunity statute in Utah in 1995, Utah legislators brought serious concerns in the legislative hearings about the constitutionality of Utah's fraud immunity statute. But essentially it passed. The adoption lobby was successful in getting it passed, and it's been on the books now 3 decades. And it gets used time and time again to reverse engineer adoptive placements that are just incredibly troubling on so many levels.
Thank you, Wes, and everybody else on the panel. You've helped me to grasp that there's a big difference between an adoption professional who is in service to the child and an adoption professional who is in service to the transaction. And now I think it's time for us to read a little bit out of our book. Kelsey?
In 1992, at age 27, my father reunited with his birth mother, whom I know as Grandma Peggy. With the help of my mother, he jumped through hoops in Illinois to find her with only a surname to guide him. Through the reunion with his birth mother, who was an adoptee herself, he found he had half-siblings as well. In 1993, my parents welcomed a baby girl, who turned out to be me. When I was 2 months old, we all traveled from Chicago to Southern California so my father's maternal birth family could meet me and embrace me into their family, now and forever our family. My grandmother bathed me, her long-lost son's daughter, in her bathroom sink and treasured that day for the remainder of her life, looking back on it with pride and radiant joy every chance we had to be together. When she passed away in 2021, she left me a scrapbook with photographs of her bathing me in the sink, and so every time I open that page, the moment lives on. When people speak to me about the lacework of family, it's common to refer to the family tree. While the tree is suitable for intact families, I envision my family as a time-worn pair of blue jeans, with every ancestor and relative as a stitch. In my family, I am the 4th consecutive generation to relinquish a child for adoption. 3 infant adoptions and 1 step-parent adoption have frayed our stitches along a single bloodline in the last century. Some of the rips and tears have been sewn back together loosely, but the thread is weak and doesn't quite match. Between my stitch and the stitches of separated family members, there are lost years and memories that never were. From the time of my infancy, it appeared that the split seams of my family's history of separation were being patched back together. I never imagined that in my early 20s, I would continue the trend and find myself disjoining a new stitch. For the first few years after placing my child for adoption, it was easy to live in ignorance that my child would stay little and adorable forever. It was effortless for me to believe that my experience of relinquishment and adoption was mine alone to lament, because my child could not yet audibly sing the duet. I could reside in my own self-pity forever, because this was something that happened to me, and to my knowledge at the time, no one else. However, when my child began to ask questions, it shocked me. It was heartening to know that he thought about me, but this information also held an uncharted future that I had not yet reckoned. I racked my brain for all the possible questions my child might ask, with no inquiry being considered too dark, to prepare an answer for the future. I soon realized that so much of my story was tangled with my child's story. Where exactly was the line? Where did my story stop and his story begin? I knew there was a separation somewhere. I felt it, I experienced it, I remembered it, but precisely where could I pencil it in? The hard truth I had to accept was that I had a meager understanding of adoption in our stories. My family's story of separation and adoption did not end with me. It will continue to be written long after I'm gone, just as my late grandmother's adoption story is still echoing throughout our lives today. Adoption's life cycles have been impacting me throughout my entire life, but I had little grasp of the magnitude. Just as I had not yet met the reality of my little one as the adult he will become, I had also never paused to picture the adults in my life as the children they once were. My father was once a young adoptee with questions. Now he's an adult adoptee who still has questions. The stitches on our family's tattered blue jeans don't simply hold the denim together. They embroider our history with a rich and complicated story. Every stitch, attached or not, is intrinsic to the garment. Watching our children grow up is difficult, whether they are the child we parent every day or the child we place for adoption. There are questions our children may have that will absolutely be uncomfortable, even potentially re-traumatizing to answer. Our relinquishment, from a legal perspective, terminates our parental rights and responsibilities, giving us a false sense of security as though we don't have a duty to our children. On the contrary, we hold crucial duties to help them discover their origin stories and biological information. Additionally, we also have a moral obligation to show up as healthy as we can for our children, while also respecting boundaries and never causing divided loyalties. Legalities aside, our children grow up and become adults, whether or not we factor this into our initial decision. Our roles and responsibilities as birth parents never vanished with our signature upon consent forms.
Okay, I'm going to do something a little bit different since we are here in Utah and choose not to read from the book this time and instead read something that I wrote that was recently published in the Deseret News. Opinion: Adoptee What Ifs and Utah's Adoption Tourism. Adoptees wrestle often with what ifs. What if my birth mother had kept me? What if I had been raised in her family? What if she's trying to find me? As an adopted child, these questions ran constantly through my head. affecting my sense of worth and causing anxiety and suicidal ideations. Only after I met my birth mother as an adult and learned my origin story did this train of thought settle. Now I'm pondering other what ifs as details about Utah's adoption tourism come to light and lawmakers consider curbing the practice of transporting out of state pregnant women into Utah to facilitate adoptions. These adoptions parallel my own, an unethical placement that should not have been allowed. Like many hopeful parents traveling to Utah to adopt, my parents crossed state lines to adopt me, where access to adoptable infants was quicker and laws more advantageous. What if they had put more thought into the ethical lines being crossed? Similar to many expectant moms lured to Utah, my birth mom encountered professionals who didn't have her best interests at heart. Her obstetrician was known as the go-to guy for unwed mothers, and a colleague of my adoptive uncle's. Despite his duty to prioritize my mother as his patient, the doctor's care was biased. What if state laws recognized that he was acting as a broker? What if my private adoption had been seen as a public child welfare issue? Like many mothers who initially make an adoption plan, my mother decided to parent me after I was born. But like mothers isolated from their families and supports when brought to Utah, she was alone and defenseless when the obstetrician pressured her toward adoption. "I don't care about you. We're done taking care of you," he said, "but that baby's not going anywhere until you come to your senses." What if the care extended to my birth mother wasn't contingent upon her relinquishing her baby? What if she wasn't treated as a disposable vessel? I was brought to my adoptive parents in the middle of the night by a lawyer who represented my adoptive parents. What if my birth mother had her own attorney giving her the informed consent necessary to make a sound decision? Would her lawyer have raised concerns over her infant being seized in the night? My adoptive parents' travel from another state compressed the timeline of my adoption, as it does for those flying into Utah to adopt. Thus, my mother was pressured to sign papers almost immediately after giving birth, during a time that's important for recovery, bonding with a newborn, and regaining coherence. What if my birth mother had been legally protected from signing adoption consents during this crucial time? Would we have both benefited from the bonding process? During our first call, my birth mother expressed sorrow for not getting me back. She and my grandmother kept diapers in their purses for weeks after my placement, praying for miracles. What if my mother had been given a reasonable legal time period to revoke the adoption before it became final? What if someone helped her find resources so her desire to raise me could have been honored? These questions reflect the strong emotional ramifications inherent in adoption, and they stem from straightforward legal processes and adoption policies that can and should be reformed. In August, legislators convened for a hearing over bill language related to the Utah Adoption Act. While I may never get satisfying answers to my what-ifs, Utah Adoption Rights proposed recommendations for policy considerations in the bill file that would circumvent exploitative adoption practices. These include allowing the revocation of consent based on fraud and extending the consent waiving period to 36 hours post-birth. They also recommended strengthening laws that prohibit unlicensed intermediaries and requiring free, separate legal representation for all expectant mothers. These recommendations, among others, would dissuade predatory practices in Utah, the only state in the nation with adoption agencies bringing in out-of-state mothers en masse. What if we worked together to stop Utah from preying on mothers and being a national shopping ground for children? What if anyone considering adoption is safe, informed, and empowered about her options, the adoption process, and her rights? What if the public called their legislators in support of these changes?
Sarah, I just find that so powerful, and I hope that anybody who advocates for best interest of the adoptee, which should be everybody, can really hear the words of an adoptee like that and the what-ifs that adoptees tend to think about. So thank you. For my reading, when we were on our first tours, I read something out of the section called Adoptive Parents Unfiltered about how to be connective and maybe ethical in the home. And for this book tour, I'm reading something from our very last section on hope and healing, our very last chapter called What Now? Beyond the walls of our home, there is need for evolution on a macro level through adoption policies, practices, and laws, starting with adoptive parents as allies. While not all people have the time, energy, resources, or desire to take part in broader change, for those who do, here's an idea. Leverage adoptive parent privilege. Adoptive parents are the ones who insert money into the adoption machine. We have a moral obligation to our counterparts to prioritize ethics and advocate for better policies and laws in the midst of our participation in a faulty system. Adoptee Astrid Castro, founder of Adoption Mosaic, says, "Every adoptive parent should be asked, when you hear the phrase ethical adoption, what does that mean to you?" Every person who is even considering adopting should be able to answer that question without getting defensive. Some adoptive parents end up appalled by all they didn't know and the hurt caused by their ignorance, and may wish to widen their circle of influence and help others who come after them. Consider what adoptee and adoptive mom Joanna Ivy suggests of adoptive parents in an interview for Adoption: The Long View. She says, "We talk a lot about privilege these days, usually in terms of racial and economic privilege. There's also a privilege that we have as hopeful adoptive parents and adoptive parents. You might think of all the ways we're not privileged as adoptive parents. We come to adoption with years of loss. We're financially vulnerable. We're holding our hearts in our hands, wanting to be parents. And all of that is true. But our privilege comes from the one thing it often comes from, and that's money. We are the consumer, and agencies cater to us in their marketing, in their services, and in the words they use. Media sees our privilege. Stories and movies and TV shows are framed with adoptive parents as heroes. Our churches and our communities see us as benevolent gifters of stable homes. We have privilege. With privilege comes power, because we can have discussions within our communities. We can talk to our adoption agencies. We can write to media companies who get adoption wrong or incomplete in their storylines. And we can ensure that adoptee voices and birth parent voices are heard and that they are valued in the same way that our voices are valued. Because we have the privilege, the power to change that narrative is on us as adoptive parents."
So, with those powerful words from Lori and the conclusion of the readings, that was mostly the end of our event. We did really enjoy chatting with our guests and signing books. On a personal note, I really enjoyed some time talking with Dani Zimmerman, who you heard on the panel. She's an Adoptee Voices writer who's been in several of my writing groups over the years. It was so sweet to connect with her in person and even get to meet her family and friends who came out to support her. Lori, you and I also had to chat with an adoptive parent who had driven many hours to come to the event. She showed me a really beautiful family tree, or constellation is what she's turning it into, not a tree, that she's made for her adopted daughter. It was beautiful. And then I got to pull up the one that I created for myself that's more of a game board. That was a fun moment. It's showing the complexities of our families, both by birth and adoption, is really important. It's also really meaningful and always a challenge. So I love getting to talk about that. I really love when there's creativity and thoughtfulness behind visual representations of all these many people who we're connected to. And then I also wanted to say that I really enjoyed connecting with Valerie Mayoral. She is a birth parent. Wonderful person, does a lot with Utah adoption rights, and she was kind enough to sell our books for us while we were running the event. Speaking of our book, Adoption Unfiltered, you can get your own copy or a gift copy at bookshop.org. You can also request it from your library if it's not already there. And of course, you can request it from your local bookseller. And it's also carried by Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and basically anywhere you get books, it's available. And just one final plug, just to say that we really appreciate your reviews wherever you get the book. It really helps to get the book into the hands of others who might need it.
We'd also like to suggest that you read Adoption Unfiltered in community. I love reading adoption-themed books with my own adoption book club because it's so helpful to get other people's take on things, even when we disagree, maybe even especially when we disagree. If you decide to do this, we have a really fun book club discussion guide on our website, adoptionunfiltered.com/book. I guarantee you'll find more in there than just questions to discuss. So what's next? Soon we're going to bring you intriguing snippets from our San Francisco and Los Angeles stops, complete with best-selling authors, researchers, a social worker, an attorney who centers birth-parent rights, and adoptees with unique aspects to them. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen so you don't miss a thing.